Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. This time, we're going to tackle something in Buddhism that can be a bit tricky.
It's a big one, for sure.
It is emptiness,
Yes.
which doesn't sound too appealing when you hear it like that, but it's actually incredibly profound and pretty exciting stuff once you start to grasp what it really means.
Exactly.
So we're going to be using this book as our guide, Introduction to Emptiness by Guy Newland. And yeah, by the end of this deep dive, you'll hopefully grasp the core of emptiness and see why it's actually seen as a source of hope rather than despair.
Right.
So let's jump right in. So I guess the first thing to address is how we as humans tend to cling to this idea of a solid self, like a me that feels separate and independent from everything else.
Yeah. It's so ingrained in us, isn't it?
It really is. And this book has a really striking analogy for that.
Yeah. Newland compares it to an addict and their drug.
Mm-hmm.
We crave that feeling of a fixed self,
Mm-hmm.
even though it often leads to disappointment or suffering.
Right. And that makes total sense. It's like we're so attached to things staying the same.
Yeah.
Whether it's a job, a relationship, or even our own health. And then inevitably things change, right?
Yeah.
Have you noticed that in your own life at all?
Absolutely.
Right.
This clinging to a fixed self is a huge cause of suffering
Right.
because it makes us resist the natural flow of change,
Yeah,
which is actually fundamental to existence.
totally. So where does emptiness fit into all of this? Like, how does that offer an alternative to all of this clinging we do?
Well, imagine the vast open sky.
Okay.
That's what emptiness is like.
Hmm.
All of our thoughts and emotions are like clouds, constantly moving through that open space.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of us being trapped by them,
Right.
we can learn to recognize them as temporary and passing phenomena.
Yeah, so it's not that our thoughts and emotions aren't real.
Right.
It's more that we don't have to be at the mercy of them.
Exactly.
Like we have the space to observe them without getting swept away.
Yes, exactly. And Newland actually quotes Tsong-Kha-Pa in the book.
Okay.
He says, right now, our powers to help others may be limited, but emptiness is the lack of chains preventing us from becoming more wise and loving.
Wow. Okay, that's powerful.
It is, isn't it?
I'm starting to get it, I think, but I still have this like knee-jerk reaction to emptiness being a kind of negative thing.
Oh, that's totally understandable.
Yeah.
It really challenges our usual way of thinking.
Yeah.
But to dive deeper, we need to look at how Tsong-Kha-Pa approached this idea.
Oh, yeah. He's a really key figure in Tibetan Buddhism, isn't he?
He is, yeah.
And from what I've read, he wasn't just a meditative mystic or something. He was a real scholar who really analyzed these Buddhist concepts rigorously.
Absolutely. He was a master of using reason and logic
Right.
to break down these complex ideas like emptiness.
Hmm.
But he always emphasized the importance of putting wisdom into action
Right.
and living a compassionate life.
Okay. So can you give us like an example of how he linked wisdom and action?
Sure. So one of the most fundamental ideas in Buddhism is karma.
Right. The idea that our actions have consequences.
Exactly. Now, you could take the idea of emptiness to an extreme and think, well, if there's no self, then my actions don't really matter.
Yeah, I see how someone might come to that conclusion.
Yeah. But Tsong-Kha-Pa actually argues the opposite.
Hmm.
He says understanding emptiness actually enhances our ethical responsibility.
Okay. How does that work?
Well, because when you really grasp that everything is interconnected, you see that your actions have this ripple effect. They impact not just you, but everything around you, the whole web of existence.
Yeah, so it's not just about like following rules or something. It's
Right.
about recognizing this interconnectedness of all things.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that makes acting ethically a natural outcome of understanding emptiness.
That's fascinating. And to help navigate this understanding, Tsong-Kha-Pa introduces the concept of two truths, ultimate truth and conventional truth,
Right.
which it sounds complicated, but I have a feeling it's key to understanding how this all actually works in our lives.
It is. Think of it this way. Ultimate truth
Mm-hmm.
points to the emptiness of inherent existence.
Okay.
But conventional truth acknowledges the way that things appear and function in the world. We need both perspectives.
Right. So, like, on one level, we can understand that things don't have this fixed, independent essence,
Right.
but we still have to live in the world, sit on chairs, drink from cups.
Absolutely. It's not about denying reality. It's about seeing it through this different lens.
Hmm.
And this is where the idea of dependent origination comes in.
Okay, yeah. That's the idea that things arise in dependence on causes and conditions, right?
Yes.
Not from some fixed essence.
Exactly. Think back to the seed and sprout analogy.
Right,
A seed doesn't have this tiny preformed sprout inside of it.
right.
It arises from a combination of factors. The seed, the soil, water, sunlight.
It's not just a simple cause and effect. It's this whole network.
It is a web of conditions.
Yeah.
And everything in the universe exists this way.
Yeah.
Including ourselves. And we're not isolated entities.
We're this flow of interconnected processes that are constantly changing.
Okay, so even though we don't have a fixed inherent self driving it all,
Right.
we exist conventionally because of this incredible web of causes and conditions.
Precisely.
It's a lot to take in. So if nothing has this inherent essence or self, how can we say anything even really exists?
That's a great question. And Tsong-Kha-Pa addresses that by outlining criteria for conventional existence.
Okay.
So something exists conventionally if it's perceptible to our senses, if it doesn't contradict our usual understanding of the world, and if it has a name or concept associated with it.
So even though a table doesn't have this like essential tableness,
Right.
you can still see it, touch it, call it a table,
Exactly.
use it as a table. It functions in our world.
Right. And this all leads to a deeper exploration of intrinsic nature.
Okay. Which is essentially what we're refuting when we talk about emptiness, right?
So I think
What is intrinsic nature? Exactly. Well, Tsong-Kha-Pa defines it as things having their own way of existing without being posited through the force of consciousness. It's the idea that things exist independently of our minds with their own inherent reality.
Right. And that's the illusion we're trying to see through here.
Yeah.
Like, things don't exist in isolation. They're part of this web of relationships and meanings that we create with our minds.
Precisely. Think about the letter A.
Okay.
Where does its A-ness reside? It's not in the ink that shaped the paper. It's a concept that we project onto that form.
Right. So it's like saying the world that we experience isn't just passively out there.
Right.
Our minds actively shape our perceptions and understanding of it.
Exactly. And to illustrate how we can really analyze and deconstruct this idea of intrinsic nature, Tsong-Kha-Pa uses a great analogy.
Okay, I love a good analogy.
It's the married bachelor.
Yeah. What a simple way to highlight a logical contradiction.
Right.
Yeah.
Imagine someone who's so fixated on finding a married bachelor. Their happiness depends on it.
Right.
But of course, by definition, a bachelor is unmarried.
Right.
So the very concept is flawed.
Yeah, you can't have both.
Exactly. And we can apply that same logic to intrinsic nature.
Okay.
The more we really examine it, the more we see that it just doesn't hold up.
It falls apart.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So Tsong-Kha-Pa takes this a step further.
He does.
And he applies it to a chariot.
Yeah. So how can we say a chariot exists if it doesn't have inherent essence?
Right.
He uses the law of the excluded middle.
Which is?
Something must be either X or not X. So is the chariot identical to its parts or different from them?
Okay.
If it's identical to its parts, it would have to share all their qualities,
Okay.
meaning it would have to be plural, like its parts.
Which is absurd.
Which is absurd,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
And if it's inherently different from its parts, where does it exist?
Right. We can't observe it separately.
We can't. So this line of reasoning shows that the chariot, just like everything else, lacks inherent essence.
Wow. It's amazing how he can use logic like that
Yeah,
to break down these assumptions we have about reality.
it is.
Yeah. So even in this analysis,
Mm-hmm.
we're relying on conventional knowledge.
Exactly.
You know, our senses and our understanding of the world to make these arguments.
Right. So even as we deconstruct inherent existence, we're still grounded in this conventional reality.
Which leads us to, I think, the ultimate question. Who am I really?
The age-old question. The Buddhism tackles head-on through this lens of emptiness.
Right?
You know, if we're clinging to this false sense of self,
Yeah.
can we ever truly understand who we are?
Right. It's like we're looking in a mirror and asking, is that really me?
Yeah.
Or is there something more?
And Buddhism suggests on an ultimate level, there is no fixed independent self.
Okay, so that's both liberating
Yeah.
and also a little unnerving to
Yeah.
think about. Like, if there's no me, then who's making decisions? Who's experiencing life?
It's a good question. And again, it comes back to remembering the two truths. So on an ultimate level, there's no self with inherent essence.
Okay.
But conventionally, we still exist as individuals,
Okay.
making choices, experiencing consequences, interacting with others.
Okay.
So this is where Tsong-Kha-Pa's analysis of the self gets really interesting.
How so?
He applies this same lack of sameness and difference argument that we use with the chariot to the concept of a person.
Okay.
So he asks, is the person identical to the mind and body or different from them?
And I'm guessing that just like with the chariot, both possibilities lead to contradictions.
You got it.
Yeah.
For example, if the self is one with the mind and body, wouldn't it be totally redundant to even talk about a self?
Right. We could just say mind and body.
Exactly. But we clearly use the word self to refer to something beyond just our physical and mental parts.
Right. So if the self is different from the mind and body, where is it? Can we point to it or observe it separately?
Exactly. And if the self is identical to this ever-changing mind and body, wouldn't that mean the self is also constantly changing?
Yeah. It would be like saying the me talking to you right now is totally different from the me who woke up this morning.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that creates problems for how we understand things like memory and our sense of continuity.
Yeah.
So by analyzing the self in this way, we start to see that it can't be pinned down to anything fixed or inherent.
The self is empty of intrinsic nature, just like everything else.
Right. We're not denying that a person exists, but
Mm.
challenging this belief in a solid, independent self.
Okay. So that's a lot to unpack just in that one concept.
It is.
And that makes me wonder, if we're not clinging to this false sense of self, how does that change our relationships, our goals, our entire sense of purpose even?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And it's something we'll explore in the next part of our deep dive.
Welcome back to our deep dive into emptiness. Last time we were really starting to dig into this idea of the self. You know, if it's empty of this inherent nature, what does that even mean for how we live our lives, how we make choices relate to others? Yeah, like it really throws those big questions into a whole new light. Does anything I do even matter? If there's no me driving it all, does that make ethics meaningless?
It's a natural concern, and Tsong-Kha-Pa goes right at this. He reminds us that understanding emptiness is all about avoiding extremes. It's not nihilism, like thinking nothing matters at all.
Right.
But it's also not essentialism, that rigid clinging to the idea of inherent reality.
So it's about finding that middle way.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Understanding emptiness, but also acknowledging the reality of our experiences. You know, that relative truth. And that's where dependent origination comes in. It helps us reconcile those two.
Okay, let's back up for a sec. Remind me how dependent origination fits into all this.
Sure. So think about that seed and sprout analogy again.
Okay.
The sprout doesn't just pop out of the seed fully formed.
Right.
It arises from a whole bunch of conditions working together. The seed itself, soil, water, sunlight, you name it.
Right. So it's not just one cause leading to one effect.
Nope. It's a whole network.
It's a web.
A web of conditions. And this is how everything exists, ourselves included. We're not separate, isolated things. But this constant flow of interconnected processes, always changing.
Okay. So we exist conventionally because of this web of causes and conditions, even though there's not this fixed, solid self behind it all.
Precisely. And this has huge implications for how we understand ethics. Because since things arise dependently, our actions do have consequences.
Okay, but hold on. If there's no doer, no self with inherent essence, then how can we be held responsible for our actions?
It's tricky. But there's a helpful analogy in the book. Imagine looking in a mirror.
Okay.
You see a reflection. And for a split second, you might mistake it for another person, especially if it's a really clear mirror.
Oh, yeah, I've totally done that. It's freaky for a second.
But there's not an actual person in the mirror.
Right. Just the reflection.
Right. But that reflection acts like a person, doesn't it? It moves when you move, changes expression when you do. It functions as a reflection.
That's true. So even though there's no inherent self, we still function as individuals.
Exactly.
We make choices, face the consequences, you know.
We're not denying those experiences, but we're seeing them through this different lens.
So our actions come from this whole web of causes and conditions, not a separate me.
Precisely. And this shifts how we see ethics.
Yeah. If we're not truly separate selves, then that really changes how I think about my relationships with other people.
Absolutely. We start to see that our well-being is completely intertwined with everyone else's. Harming someone, in a way, ultimately harms ourselves, and helping others ultimately benefits us too.
It's like that saying, no man is an island.
Exactly. There's this great quote from Tsong-Kha-Pa in the book. A reflection of a face is undeniably a conjunction of, one, being empty of the eyes, ears, and such that appear therein, and two, being produced in dependence upon a mirror and a face, while disintegrating when certain of these conditions are gone. Likewise, the person lacks even a particle of intrinsic nature, but is the accumulator of karma and the experiencer of effects, and is produced in dependence upon earlier karma and afflictions.
Wow. Okay, that's a long one. Break that down for me.
He's basically comparing a reflection in a mirror to a person. So just like the reflection looks like it has eyes, ears, and nose, but doesn't actually have those things.
Right, it's just an image.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And in the same way, a person might seem to have this inherent self, but ultimately is empty of that.
So we're not denying that a person has a body and a mind,
Yeah.
but we're saying that the self we cling to as this real thing, it's an illusion.
Exactly. And just like the reflection exists because of the mirror in the face, a person exists dependent on all sorts of causes and conditions, including past actions, karma, and mental afflictions.
So he's tying this back to karma. But if there's no self, how can there even be karma?
It's not that there's no continuity, no sense of self at all over time, but it's not based on some fixed essence. Think of it like a river.
Okay.
The river's constantly flowing, changing, but it still has a sense of continuity. Our actions are kind of like ripples in that river, leaving these imprints that shape future experiences. That's karma. It's not this soul being punished or rewarded, but just the way consciousness keeps flowing.
So there is a connection between what we do and what happens as a result, even without a fixed self.
Exactly. Which makes how we act, ethical behavior, all the more important.
Okay, so this whole idea of the self being an illusion,
Yeah.
how do we actually dismantle this illusion? We've talked about using analysis, logic, but is that all it takes? Just thinking our way out of it? It seems like there must be more.
You're right. Tsong-Kha-Pa emphasizes that realizing emptiness takes both analysis and meditation.
So it's understanding it intellectually and experiencing it directly.
Yes. And the book talks about insight, which is a special kind of seeing. And it arises when those two come together.
Okay, so what's the missing ingredient besides analysis? What else do we need?
What Buddhists call serenity. And this comes from meditation. It's a really deep mental stability and focus, quieting the mind, letting go of distractions.
So we're not trying to empty our minds completely,
No.
but training them to be calm and present.
Exactly. And when we combine that with a clear understanding of emptiness from study, that's when we start to get a deeper grasp of it. Like not just knowing, but seeing it.
Like reading about a beautiful place versus actually being there.
Perfect analogy.
Yeah.
That's where the practice becomes so important.
So we need that back and forth, intellectual understanding, then experiential practice.
The book calls it alternating between analysis and stabilization.
Okay, what's stabilization in this context?
It's resting the mind in that state of serenity.
Okay.
But while you're focused on what you've understood about emptiness, letting the insight sink in.
So this isn't just a one-time aha moment.
No, it's an ongoing process of deepening our understanding through both thinking and meditating.
Got it. And as we do this, our whole perception starts to shift, right? What changes when we really realize emptiness?
One of the biggest things is we loosen that grip on the fixed self. We start to feel more ease and fluidity in life.
Makes sense. If you're not so busy defending and protecting this idea of yourself.
We can just be.
Right.
And as that clinging loosens, compassion naturally arises. A more open-hearted way of being with others.
Like the wall between me and them starts to crumble.
Yes. And that's the real power here. Emptiness isn't just a heady concept. It's a path to freedom, wisdom, compassion. Those really matter in life.
I'm convinced, but it all sounds like a tall order. How do we actually do this, cultivate this insight?
That's the million-dollar question. And that's what we'll explore in the final part of our deep dive. Specific practices and techniques that can help us understand and live this truth.
Welcome back to our deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground with emptiness, haven't we? From that initial, what is this feeling, to seeing how freeing this concept can be.
It really gets to the heart of Buddhist thought and practice.
Yeah. Last time we were talking about how realizing emptiness takes more than just thinking about it.
Right.
We need that analysis, but also serenity.
Mm-hmm.
That calm focus you get from meditation.
Exactly.
So how do those two actually work together?
Well, there's a great analogy in the book from a sutra. It's about two trees rubbing together.
Oh.
And through that friction, they create fire.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
And that fire eventually consumes the trees themselves.
Okay, so how does this relate to insight?
Well, think of those two trees as representing our analytical wisdom and our meditative focus.
Okay.
When we practice both, they rub together like those trees and generate the fire of insight.
So just understanding emptiness intellectually or just meditating without that clear understanding,
Right.
It's not enough.
They need each other.
Yeah.
And as that fire grows, it burns away the separation between subject and object.
Yeah.
That sense of a me observing emptiness dissolves.
So it's like the analytical mind, the one that's been dissecting everything.
Yeah.
It merges with the emptiness it's been trying to grasp.
Exactly. What's left is this direct perception, non-dual, a profound freedom where clinging to a fixed self has vanished completely.
It's kind of mind-bending to think about.
It is.
We use our minds to deconstruct the self, and through that process, the mind itself is transformed.
Yeah. It really turns our usual way of experiencing the world upside down.
And this is what the Buddhist path is all about, isn't it?
It is.
Waking up to reality as it is and being free from suffering.
Tsong-Kha-Pa says it very clearly. There's no other way to achieve lasting peace.
Okay. Do you have that quote handy?
I do, he says. If you analytically discern the lack of self in phenomena, and if you cultivate that very analysis in meditation, this will cause the result, attainment of nirvana. There is no peace through any other means.
Wow. Okay, if it's that powerful, why don't we all just drop everything and meditate 24/7?
Well, that's where skillful means come in. Buddhism recognizes that there's no one-size-fits-all approach.
Right, like we all have different lives and capacities.
Exactly. So it's about finding the practices that fit your individual needs and circumstances.
So that could be ethical conduct, cultivating kindness, studying Buddhist teachings,
All right.
different types of meditation,
Finding that balance between wisdom and compassion.
inner work, and how we engage with the world.
Yeah. And the book even cautions against jumping into advanced practices without the right foundation.
What does that foundation look like?
It starts with basic qualities:
Okay.
generosity, patience, ethical discipline,
Hmm.
and a sincere desire to help others.
It's like building a house. Gotta have that solid base before you add the roof.
Exactly. As we cultivate those qualities, we become more receptive to teachings like emptiness.
Like softening the ground of our minds so those seeds of wisdom can really take root.
Yeah. And as we understand this more and more, it starts to change how we actually live our lives.
So how does understanding emptiness show up in everyday life?
It could mean facing challenges with more calmness.
Okay.
Knowing that they're impermanent.
Right.
And that they arise from causes and conditions.
Like instead of getting swept up in reacting and resisting,
Exactly.
we can respond with wisdom and compassion.
Yeah. We could also see more clearly how everything's connected, seeing ourselves as part of this vast web of life.
Which leads to more care,
Mm-hmm.
more responsibility for everything around us.
Precisely. Living with this understanding is about embracing everything about being human, while also recognizing its impermanent, interconnected nature.
It's a real balancing act, isn't it?
It is.
Engaging with the world, but letting go of clinging. Recognizing our unique self, but knowing we're part of something so much bigger.
It takes courage and commitment and the willingness to really question our deepest assumptions about reality.
But it sounds like the rewards are worth it.
I think so. More freedom, wisdom, compassion.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I'm left with this question for everyone listening. How might understanding emptiness change the way you approach challenges in your own life?
It's a question worth sitting with, because in that understanding lies the potential for real transformation.
A life lived with more wisdom, compassion, and peace.
That's what we're all searching for, isn't it?
I think so.
If you want to explore this further, we highly recommend Introduction to Emptiness by Guy Newland.
It's a brilliant guide to this complex and ultimately liberating idea.
Happy exploring, everyone.
Until next time,